Think the 2008 crash was some kind of wild one-off disaster that came out of nowhere? Yeah, no. If you zoom out, it looks a lot less like a freak accident and a lot more like a tradition. One of the only traditions this country has actually stuck to for 200 plus years. What's up, everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is another episode of Past Is Prologue, where I dig into earlier chapters of American history to figure out what the hell is happening right now. Today, I want to talk about something that might seem unsexy on paper, but has shaped basically everybody's life in this country, whether they know it or not. Economic crashes. Panics, depressions, recessions, whatever label was technically appropriate or fashionable at the time. Because once you line them up, from the Panic of 1819 all the way up to the Great Recession, you start to see the same movie playing on a loop. A new version of the market economy ramps up, credit and lending explode, speculation goes nuts, the people in charge swear this time it's safe, then it all blows up. Regular people eat the shit sandwich, and we discover that maybe we should have had a lot more rules in place. And then, a generation later, we forget all the things we should have learned and repeat the whole idiotic cycle again. If there are two words I think you ought to tattoo on your brain coming out of this discussion, these are them: regulation and speculation. Regulation, as in the rules put in place at the state and especially the federal level to determine what banks and businesses can, and even more importantly, what they cannot do. Speculation, as in individual American investors, investment groups, and even chartered banks making bets on which assets they ought to buy because these assets are going to explode in value and make the buyers rich, probably quick. It's regulation, really lack of regulation, and reckless, overly optimistic speculation that together take many of these economic downturns from a bad scene for a few months or a year to a total economic train wreck that devastates the economy and many Americans' lives for years. So let's walk through the greatest hits on this chart, full of greed, shady finance men, even shadier hustlers selling dreams for cash, and government officials who are either in on the scams or too ignorant to recognize the slow-motion disaster as it unfolds. Number one, the Panic of 1819, the first national faceplant. We'll start right after the War of 1812. The U.S. is feeling pretty good about itself. The war's over, and lots of folks have deluded themselves into the idea that it was a big American triumph. Nationalism is on the rise as a consequence, and tons of Americans are super pumped up about the economy finally being unleashed after a decade of embargo, trade war, and actual war with Great Britain. There's a land boom in the West as Indians are being kicked off their ancestral homes. Cotton prices are way up, and the demand for both cotton and American foodstuffs all over Europe couldn't be higher. New state-chartered banks are handing out loans like Halloween candy, printing bank paper that they don't have nearly the specie, that is, gold and silver, to back up. The Second Bank of the United States and a swarm of state banks are basically saying, sure, here's money, go buy land, go plant cotton, it'll all work out. There is rampant speculation on land that everyone buying it or lending the money to buy it just knows will be profitable right away. Even the Bank of the U.S., who's supposed to be regulating all this by demanding evidence of specie and payment in specie for a lot of its notes, is relaxing standards because of the imperative from almost everyone in government to get the frontier settled and developed yesterday. But there are many wildcat banks that even the Bank of the U.S. can't really put in check or even monitor all that effectively in the western and southern states. You know where this is going. It does not all work out. Cotton prices crash on the world market, and European farmers, finally able to tend their land after decades of fighting, have a bumper food crop in 1817-18. Land that everyone thought would make them rich suddenly isn't worth what they paid for it. The Bank of the U.S. tightens credit, demanding that these state-chartered banks operating by the seat of their pants start paying their loans in specie rather than in their own depreciated paper or even Bank of the U.S. notes. Local banks are suddenly calling in loans to be paid in full by farmers who thought they had years to pay off the mortgages, and foreclosures skyrocket. Banks start failing and credit evaporates. In the aftermath, farmers all over the country lose their land, small businesses go under as demand plummets, unemployment spikes in cities, and this is the first time that Americans experience a nationwide depression, not just a bad harvest or a local slump, but a broad economic collapse caused by the way the new market economy is wired. Politically, it's the opening act of a long-running argument that we still have today. Was the problem too much government and a big national bank, or unregulated speculation and loose credit? And to my mind, the pattern is undeniable. When we loosen lending standards and regulations on financial institutions, it invites a whole bunch of bad actors to sell snake oil and promise unsophisticated investors a quick windfall. Even those who should know better get caught up in their own insatiable greed and make stupid bets that don't pay off. The ugly pattern is already established in 1819. Easy money plus speculation plus no safety net equals mass misery. Number 2, the Panic of 1837. Jackson kills the monster, and the economy follows. So you fast forward a couple of decades, and Andrew Jackson comes into office hating the national bank with the fire of 1,000 suns. His hatred never really garnered less than the fire of 500 suns. He was a pretty angry, bitter, miserable human being. To Jackson, the Bank of the U.S. was a corrupt tool of elites, and he played that angle up repeatedly as he ran for re-election in 1832. Jackson vetoed the bank's recharter, which his opponents, admittedly, put up early to screw him politically. They thought he couldn't veto it, and it would put him in a bad place with his base. He pulls federal deposits, and he sprays all of these deposits into a bunch of state pet banks. That's what his opponents called them, derisively. At the same time, land prices soar again as folks are trying to get rich cornering the cotton market. British credit is flowing in as investors there look to benefit from the American cotton and infrastructure explosion of the 1830s. And there is not nearly enough hard money, again, gold and silver specie, to back up all of this speculation. On top of that, there is no national bank to set the standards and monitor or rein in what Jackson's pet banks are doing. There's no national bank to manage the country's money supply, the worth of its paper currency, or to provide a stable medium of exchange apart from gold and silver. Then the shit hits the fan. The British tighten credit because some financial head honchos come to their senses about all the money they've been lending out to Americans. Jackson's administration issues what is known as the specie circular, basically saying you need hard money, gold or silver, to buy federal land. And while a lot of sensible people applaud that as a conservative approach designed to curb speculation, there's no one to actually enforce it now that the Bank of the U.S. is dead. Additionally, there's nothing to reliably replace the notes the Bank of the U.S. used to issue. People start to freak out about all this small bank paper they're using for various transactions. Confidence evaporates. For the first time, banks, particularly those in New York, experience what becomes known as a bank run, in which everyone who can tries to pull their deposits or exchange paper money for specie. If you know anything at all about banking, you know why this is a disaster. And within just a few weeks, it's not confined to New York banks anymore. Banks everywhere suspend specie payments for any kind of paper. The stock market crashes. Businesses collapse. All of this might have been just a blip, but then all the speculation in potential cotton land gone buck wild out west comes back to bite hard in 1838. Cotton prices plummet, and the investments aren't worth 10% of what they had been, the investments in land. It's a depression on top of a depression, which becomes the worst economic downturn in the United States until the Great Depression of the 1930s. Once again, ordinary people lose farms, jobs, and savings. The political class blames each other's policies while pretending the larger boom-bust structure is just how markets work. No significant reforms are made to the banking system until the Civil War begins in the 1860s. In the meantime, President Van Buren tells all the common folk suffering from the effects of the Depression that they had nothing to do with, to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and pound sand. There's no help coming from the federal government for these poor people. All this inertia leads to another panic in 1857, by the way. This time caused by speculation in both land and railroads, but it gets overshadowed by the Civil War. If 1819 was America's first economic hangover, 1837 is the second time we get drunk on the same bottle. Only we decide the best approach is to eat nothing, snort a couple lines of blow and Adderall, and bank on feeling fine in the morning. Number 3, the Long Depression, 1873 and the railroad bubble. Now, jump past the Civil War into the Gilded Age, which is the nickname that Mark Twain gave for the last 3 decades of the 1800s. When railroads are the hot investment play, railroads are everything to the incipient economic superpower that is the United States in the 19th century. Their infrastructure, their speculative assets, their symbols of progress. Investors pour money into lines that don't really have the traffic to justify them. Banks underwrite railroad bonds like they're fireproof. A huge finance house, J. Cook & Company, bets big on railroad expansion. Then, again, reality shows up. It all starts with a textbook financial panic in Central Europe based around, you guessed it, railroads. Once again, American economic expansion in the form of both infrastructure and finance depends on European capital. And when the panic in Austria-Hungary bleeds over to the UK, the credit crunch begins once more. The Coinage Act of 1873, suddenly limiting the use of silver as an acceptable form of specie, doesn't do the system any favors. Of course, what happened in Europe only mattered to the US because the system in the United States was way over-leveraged in risky railroad investments. And those on the inside did whatever they could to line their pockets to make sure that the crash came fast and furious. J. Cook collapses in 1873. Confidence in railroad securities evaporates. Banks fail, credit dries up. The result is what people at the time call a panic, but what economists now usually label the Long Depression. It's years of deflation, unemployment, and labor unrest. This is the era of falling prices and wages, massive strikes like the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, a sense among workers and farmers that the system is rigged in favor of railroad barons and financiers. It all traces back to a system with too few rules, too little monitoring of the rules that do exist, and far too much reckless speculation on the part of individuals and institutions looking to make a killing fast. Once more, a new infrastructure boom pumped up by speculative finance goes way too far, and when it breaks, the pain lands on the people at the bottom, the vast majority of whom had no responsibility for or stake in what collapsed the economy. Sound familiar yet? Number 4. The Panic of 1893, déjà vu with extra misery. You'd think the Long Depression would have taught people something. Instead, everyone imbibes too much of the same toxic fluids again. By the 1890s, the US has overbuilt railroads once more. Huge railroad holding companies are playing accounting games. Debt is stacked on top of debt. The gold standard, courtesy of the Coinage Act of 1873, limits the government's flexibility to respond. In 1893, a couple of major railroads go under. The stock market tanks, and foreign investors pull money out of the United States suddenly, again. Over 500 banks fail. Something like a quarter of the railroads in the country go bankrupt. Unemployment hits staggering levels. You get Coxey's army marching into Washington to demand public works. You get the Pullman strike and a national showdown between labor and capital. You get William Jennings Bryan railing against a cross of gold in 1896, a populist call to intentionally create inflation that will relieve the burden of debtors, mostly farmers at this point. And underneath all that political theater is the same basic engine: credit-fueled expansion, weak regulation, and a total disregard for what happens when the music stops. Because the folks pulling the strings don't end up unemployed with nothing to eat. Number 5, the big one, the Great Depression, when the whole system explodes. All of this that I've discussed up to this point, all these panics, is just a place setting for the true cataclysm, the Great Depression. The 1920s were sold as a period of endless prosperity. You've got cheap credit and installment buying all over the place, even like clothing stores. Stock market speculation, often with borrowed money, on margin, which is this idiotic practice that was legal in the 1920s of allowing somebody to buy stock they didn't have the money to purchase. The stockbroker would effectively loan the purchaser the money, and when the stock became profitable, the purchaser would just take their profit. Of course, we all know you can't bank on that. If making money in the stock market was that easy, fucking everybody would do it. On top of all of these shady stock buying practices, you got a banking system full of small, shaky banks and almost no federal oversight. Then the stock market crashes in 1929. A lot of people treat that as the cause, but it's really the moment when the underlying fragility of the system becomes impossible to ignore. It's merely the opening salvo, if you will, of what will be years of bank collapses to the point where credit disappears, and the lack of intervention on the part of the dogmatic Hoover administration worsens the crisis for 3 solid years. From 1929 to 1933, when FDR is finally inaugurated, thousands of banks fail. 1932 was actually the fucking peak year of bank failures in terms of sheer numbers. That means that bank failures went up from the stock market crash of 1929 for years. 1 out of 4 workers loses his job, and another 10% can't find full-time employment, which means an absolutely staggering 1 out of every 3 Americans seeking work is either unemployed or underemployed. Farmers already on the edge because of a rough decade in the 1920s get hammered by both low prices and environmental disaster. I'm talking about the Dust Bowl. Watch or read Grapes of Wrath if you'd like to know more. It's the most brutal economic crisis in US history and arguably world history. I mean, the Nazis and fascist Japan didn't just come out of nowhere. It finally, though, forces a reckoning. For once, we don't just patch things over and march on. The New Deal actually changes the plumbing of the financial system. Federal deposit insurance, the FDIC, so your savings don't vanish when a bank fails. Strict limits on what banks can do with deposits. No more using your savings to play the stock market. The first serious regulation of a whole swath of securities. A larger welfare state, Social Security, unemployment insurance, the TVA, the government jobs that are priming the pump, as John Maynard Keynes put it. You can argue about how effective each of these specific policies was, but for a few decades after the 1930s, we basically decide, yeah, maybe unfettered finance isn't such a great idea. Maybe the government should not let Wall Street light itself on fire every 15 years. And for decades, that works. There are recessions, for sure, but nothing like 1819, 1837, 1873, 1893, and certainly not like the nadir of the 1930s. Number 6, deregulation and the road to 2008. Starting in the 1970s and really gathering steam in the 1980s and 90s, the goldfish memory strikes again. Inflation, oil shocks, and slower growth give far too much volume to a bunch of free market radicals who argue that regulation is the problem. Free markets will fix everything, these acolytes of Ayn Rand insist, as long as we take the shackles off. Piece by piece, the New Deal guardrails get chipped away. Banking rules are relaxed or eliminated altogether. New financial instruments, derivatives, mortgage-backed securities, all the alphabet soup, develop faster than anyone bothers to regulate them. There's a broad, bipartisan faith that the market knows best and that big, sophisticated firms can manage their own risk. We even get a dress rehearsal for the disaster that comes in the 1980s, the savings and loan crisis, where deregulated thrifts blow themselves up with bad real estate bets and the public eats the cost. We learned some lessons, but not the most important ones, because it all peaks in 1999 when the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, signed into law by Bill Clinton, puts the final nail in the coffin of the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. For decades, there was a solid wall of separation between investment banks and commercial banks. The Graham Bill obliterates that last core vestige of New Deal banking reform, which brings us to number 7, the Great Recession. In the early 2000s, the hot asset isn't land in Ohio or a railroad in Kansas. It's housing. For a while, prices go up, 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 up. Lending standards collapse. If you can fog a mirror, you can get a mortgage. Where standards don't disappear, there is rampant fraud by lenders whose greed and nihilism circumvent any semblance of respectable financial practices. Those mortgages get chopped up and repackaged into complex and completely opaque securities that ratings agencies swear are safe. Behind the curtain, it's the same old game, though. Leverage. Mountains of borrowed money amplifying both gains and losses. Banks not keeping enough in reserve, not nearly. Opacity, again. Nobody really understands where the risk is sitting. Even the supposed financial experts refuse to recognize the frailty of the system that they're constructing. Confidence theater. Everyone insists that the system is resilient, right up until it isn't. Government impotence. The regulatory regime has been weakened to the point that even those who are crying foul in the government can't do much of anything to stop the avalanche as it builds. When housing prices stop rising and people start defaulting, the whole Rube Goldberg machine shits itself. In 2008, major financial institutions once again fail or need massive bailouts. Credit once again collapses. Millions of people once again lose their homes and jobs. And then we do something very American. We save the system and the amoral architects of the catastrophe, but not the people victimized by it. The banks get emergency support. The folks who packaged bad loans into gold-plated, gilded dog-shit securities mostly keep their jobs and their bonuses. No one goes to jail. The people who actually took out those loans, the ones whose jobs vanished when the real economy tanked, they grab their ankles. Again, the pattern. Private gains during the boom, socialized losses during the bust. So what does any of this tell us about now? When you stack these crises together, 1819, 1837, 1873, 1893, 1929, 2008, you start to see some impossible to ignore themes. Let me boil it down. We keep treating booms as though they're not built on foundations of sand. Every time there's some new engine of growth, whether it's Western land, cash crops, railroads, factories, suburban houses, dot-coms, whatever, the people who benefit the most insist this time it's different. We've tamed all the risk. The old laws of financial gravity don't apply. They said it in the 1920s. They said it in the 1990s. And they absolutely said it in the 2000s about housing. History's very blunt response: no, you haven't, and yes, they do. The people selling the upside rarely eat the downside. Whether it's 19th century railroad magnates, 1920s stock promoters, or 21st century investment banks, the story is consistent. The people designing and selling the risky system get rich. When it collapses, they either get bailed out or land softly. The people with the least cushion, farmers, factory workers, homeowners with one house and one job, take the real hit. We have a long, proud history of privatizing gains and nationalizing losses. Another thing, reform comes late and under duress, if at all. We almost never act before the catastrophe. The pattern is boom, crash, years of pain, political pressure reaches a breaking point, then finally we change some rules sometimes. The New Deal is the clearest example of this. The progressive reforms after the Long Depression and the Gilded Age are another. But the same thing is true after 2008. Only in the wake of total system failure do we get serious conversations about capital requirements, consumer protection, and so forth. And even then, memory is short and deregulation always seems to come back. Give it a generation or two, let the people who lived through the last crash die or retire, and suddenly, regulations are burdensome. Safeguards are anti-innovation. The guardrails become optional. Then we build a new, shinier version of the same unstable structure and act shocked when it implodes. So what's the use of knowing any of this? What do we actually do with this history besides get depressed? To me, there are a few practical takeaways. Number one, stop believing that prosperity without guardrails is sustainable. Booms built on easy credit and wishful thinking always end badly. Maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but eventually they do. Be extremely skeptical of people who profit from telling you the fundamentals are strong. The 19th century bankers, the 1920s brokers, the 2000s mortgage guys, they all said the same things right up until the crash. If we are going to keep experimenting with new forms of capitalism, we need to build the goddamn motherfucking landing gear first. Training relocation help, stronger social safety nets like generous unemployment, and how about universal fucking healthcare? All the stuff that might let regular people survive the next creative destruction wave without losing years, their sanity, and perhaps their lives. Look it up. Depressions and recessions mean deaths of despair. People give up and tragic things happen even when they had nothing to do with where they ended up. And maybe the biggest single thing that I could advise, understand that crisis is not an accident in this system as we've built it. It is a feature. A version of capitalism that depends on constant growth, constant innovation, and constant risk-taking is going to overshoot and crash. The only question is, who gets a nice, soft, padded mat to fall on, and who gets an anchor instead of a parachute? If history is any guide, we're not going to somehow grow out of boom-bust cycles, but we can decide whether the next crash looks more like 1819, no safety net, you're on your own, or something closer to a rough landing that people can actually walk away from. We can choose to force our legislators to put more rules and safeguards in place, and maybe this system of boom and bust might at least be mitigated. These measures can both limit the severity of future crises by putting more watchdogs on the block and can ease the fallout by providing more Kevlar vests for those caught in the crossfire. The economic crashes we should expect going forward can mean just whiplash instead of contused organs and shattered bones. That's the choice. And pretending our current setup is unprecedented or uniquely baffling just lets the people who built it off the hook. This growing artificial intelligence bubble is just that. Don't think for a moment it's not. Anyway, thanks for listening. I hope this gave you a clearer sense of how often we've driven the economy off a cliff on purpose and how rarely we've bothered to ask who's sitting in the back seat. I'll be back before too long with another round of Past Meets Present. Until then, take care, and maybe don't believe the next guy who tells you the good times can't possibly end.